Are you ready for chapter 3? Now, when we left off from chapter 2, Maggie and Ivy had talked to their dads about what they had seen at the Hokum house. But their dads acted as though it had always been like that Hokum house had always looked lovely. And then we got to finally hear the legend of the Crowwood Witch. And if you remember, it was a little bit spooky because the Crowwood Witch had to eat the souls and the hearts of 13 children. So now we're going to go into chapter 3. This chapter is called Bad News. Chapter 3, Bad News. She ate the hearts of 12 children, Ivy said through her hands. They were covering her mouth, which was agape in horror. Supposedly, yes, Miss Moody said, smiling sadly, although her left eye twitched nervously. It seemed this was a story that made even grown-ups feel uncomfortable. Didn't you ever wonder who those names were that we read at the festival belonged to? She asked, but Ivy shrugged. The festival for the 12 doesn't happen every year, just when there's a blue moon. I've been to... Ivy closed one eye and concentrated and counted on her fingers. 5. 5 festivals have taken place in my lifetime, and I can only really remember 2 of them. For the rest, I would have been much too little. In between festivals, people don't really talk about it much. Miss Moody nodded sympathetically. Yes, I suppose it's like playing Christmas songs in January. People don't want to hear them. Why should it be different for our festival? The legend of the Crowwood Witch, however, is a little gruesome. I'm not convinced it's true, the librarian started to gently guide the girls away from the book. Of course it's true. It's a legend, Maggie said, pointing back to the tomb. Well, a legend is a story that has been passed down through generations, and we often have no way of knowing where it came from. For all we know, our legend may simply be a story that parents tell their children to teach them not to talk to strangers, said Miss Moody. Then why do we have a festival if it's just made up? Seems like a big waste of everyone's time and energy, if you ask me. Maggie folded her arms. Ivy was getting the distinct sense that Maggie wanted the legend to be true. No one loved the festival more than Maggie, and she didn't want it to be based on nothing more than nonsense. Maggie, Miss Moody bent down to look at her. You take more books out of this library than anyone I've ever known. And you love stories. What's the problem with this one? It's different, Maggie said, but she wasn't sure she believed what she was saying. It is? Think about your favorite story. Think about the characters in it and the world they come from. Now think about how that story makes you feel when you read it. Miss Moody was right. Maggie did take a lot of books out of the library, and she owned loads of books at home too. In fact, her book collection was her pride and joy. Sometimes after she read a book, it was all she thought about for days. The characters felt as real to her as Ivy did, and a story could make her heart swell with so much love and hope that tears spilled out of her eyes. If she could hold a week-long festival for just one of her favorite stories, she'd do it with no questions asked. Yeah, okay, she said with a sheepish glance at Ivy. I guess I understand. Besides, said Miss Moody, Crowwood Peak doesn't have a very exciting history. That legend puts us on the map, so we must make the most of it. I guess I just wished it had a happier ending, Ivy said, shrugging. But that's the thing, Ivy, Maggie put on her spookiest voice. It hasn't had its ending yet. Oh, let's not go scaring the poor thing, Miss Moody said, shaking her head. I'm serious, though, Miss Moody. The prophecy in the book says 300 years she won't be seen, but she'll return to claim 13. This year marks 300 years since the Crowwood Witch disappeared. And then this strange woman showed up last night and moved in next door, and it went from being a pigsty to a house fit for royalty in a matter of minutes. And you mean Amy's house? Oh, Maggie, what a lot of nonsense. Miss Moody wafted past them to the front desk of the library and busied herself with some files. Maggie was about to continue explaining what they had seen the night before when Ivy put a hand on her shoulder. Wait, who? She asked the librarian. Amy? You know Amy, don't you? Well, you must, since you both live next door to her. The librarian teetered in a high-pitched tone that sounded very unlike Miss Moody they knew. No one knows where the Crowwood Witch's real house is. It's been lost for centuries, but I can assure you that it certainly isn't Amy's house. What a silly notion indeed. Maggie and Ivy exchanged looks. Whatever had bewitched their fathers to make them forget how Hokum House used to look and believe that they knew the woman who had moved in had also got a hold of Miss Moody. But Miss Moody, the biggest part of the festival is gathering at Hokum House, next door to us, and reading out the names of the 12 children that were taken. They're carved on the stones round the house, said Maggie. Stones? Maggie? What stones? Miss Moody's face began to change. For a moment she looked confused, not only by the girls and their presence and their persistence about the legend of Crowwood Witch, but also by the words coming out of her own mouth. Ivy suddenly had that same odd feeling that she had when she was talking to her father. She could hear Miss Moody's voice, but somehow it was someone else's thoughts and feelings. Now, it's going to get dark soon. Best you two get yourself off home for dinner, she said with a smile. But then a dark cloud passed over her face, and she added, in a voice quite unlike her own, "And no bothering Amy with all this Hokum House nonsense." "Okay, Miss Moody," Ivy said with a sweet smile. Maggie turned to look at her and took a giant breath, ready to protest, but Ivy gave her a look that Maggie recognized as, "I have a plan" face. "Oh, and I think I left something over by the book. Back in a minute. Maggie, will you come with me?" "Oh, of course I can, Ivy," Maggie said slowly and loudly. "It would be my pleasure after you—" Ivy gave her a nudge. "Stop acting weird. Just be normal," she hissed. Together they made their way back to the book with the legend. "Look," Ivy said as she pointed to the note below the case that described the house. She pointed so fiercely that she left a little greasy smudge on the glass, where she had to wipe away with the sleeve of her jumper. "It says here, Hokum House has been abandoned for 300 years. Not a soul had dared to cross the threshold of Hokum House in all that time, and it has had no choice but to fall into disrepair. Anyone left alive without anyone left alive to care for it. It even says that the cat is called Ramshackle because the house it lives in is exactly that, ramshackle." "So you mean it's not us?" Maggie said, leaning in closer and reading the librarian's card for herself. "We're not making this up? It's everyone else who seems to be telling weird stories about Hokum House and Amy, whoever she is." Maggie looked at the book again and gasped in surprise. The note below it had vanished. But, it was right there a moment ago. "Maggie, what on earth is going on?" Ivy reached for her friend's hand. Maggie looked at it and squeezed it tightly. "I don't know, Ivy, but whatever it is, it doesn't feel good." Ivy and Maggie scraped pretty quickly and were quiet for a few minutes after leaving the library, trying to take in what had happened. "We're not going round the twist, are we?" Maggie asked quietly. The wind was really picking up now, and the sky was beginning to darken with some angry-looking clouds that seemed ready to burst at any moment. No, we're absolutely not," Ivy said, again not quite believing herself as she said it. "I think it's time to convene a meeting of the Double Trouble Society." Maggie pushed her fist into the air. "Yes!" Crowwood Peak sometimes had tourists visiting because of the legend. There weren't many, but when they did come, the Causey Cauldron was sure to be a pit stop on their tour. It had a spooky autumn vibe all year round. There were cobwebs dangling from the light fixtures, and jars containing fake eyeballs and red liquids sitting on every table as a centerpiece. It wasn't Maggie and Ivy's first choice of a location for a hot drink, but on this occasion, they thought it might give them some inspiration. "We need to go through what we know to be fact and hold them tight, regardless of what anyone else says," Ivy said firmly. "Okay, so what are the facts?" Maggie asked before she took a big slurp from her mug, which was piled high with whipped cream and dotted with pink marshmallows. "Fact number 1, Ivy said, twisting her saucer so that Maggie could reach the biscuit that came with her hot chocolate. Maggie had already eaten hers, and Ivy knew she how much she liked them. Hokum House looked like it had been through several natural disasters before that woman showed up last night. Right. Fact 2, Maggie said with her mouth full. Neither of us had ever seen that woman before last night, and she has certainly never lived next door. Correct. Fact number 3. Neither of us knew she was called Amy. Because how could we? We've never met her. Maggie's voice was getting higher and higher with frustration. Exactly. Fact number 4. There was writing on a card below the book in the library that described Hokum House as completely and utterly abandoned for 300 years, and then it totally vanished. It did. Ivy and Maggie were quiet again for a moment, both trying to find an explanation for how a written card could disappear from inside a sealed glass case without either of them noticing. Ivy took her first sip of hot chocolate while Maggie drained the dregs of gooey melted marshmallows from the bottom of her mug. Finally, and maybe the most worrying, fact number 5, Ivy stared into her mountain of whipped cream like it was a crystal ball. If the woman who moved in next door is a witch, then she's shown up exactly 300 years since the Crowwood Witch disappeared, and that can't be good news. Outside on the street, the brown leaves were blowing up into a frenzy as the wind began to howl, rattling the glass to the window. The lights flickered momentarily. Does that usually happen? Maggie asked, looking up at the mini chandelier above their table. I really hope so, Ivy said, but I think maybe it's time we went home. As the girls walked home, they noticed the clouds were getting darker and darker. It was only when their houses came into view that they saw the clouds weren't clouds at all. What they were seeing was smoke, giant plumes of it, pouring out of the chimney and creating some sort of glittery vortex above Hokum House. Maggie grabbed Ivy's hand and together they ran to the house's front gate and peered over it. Look, Maggie pointed to one of the 12 stones. It was about the size of a small melon, and although it was covered in moss, you could still make out some of the letters of the name, Elijah Brown, engraved across it. The stones are still here. We can't be making things up, Ivy. It's everyone else. They've created a different story in their head. The witch must have done that. But that's not possible, Ivy said, looking bewildered. I know it's not reasonable or logical, but it is happening. I think I'm starting to freak out a little bit. Maggie put her hands behind her head and her breathing began to quicken. Maggie, Ivy said, but Maggie was working herself up into a bit of a state. She had begun to pace up and down, walking in circles, talking more to herself than Ivy. No, I know what you're going to say. You're going to tell me that the facts don't support my theory, she said. Maggie, she tried again, but it was no use. Maggie was officially freaking out now. You're going to say that there's no way everyone's minds had been whipped and Ivy dug her elbow into her friend's ribs. Ow! Maggie cried. Maggie, we're no longer alone. Ivy looked at Maggie and tried to discreetly gesture towards the house with only her eyes. Maggie glanced in the direction of the house for long enough to notice the woman who was apparently called Amy, the woman who everyone seemed to know except for them. The woman standing in the window of the house, swirling her hands in circles in front of her. Her fingers began to glow a vibrant purple, matching her eyes. Then, as she pointed to the skies, out of nowhere, Ramshackle the cat suddenly hopped up on the fence and began to yowl, louder than any cat they'd ever heard. With a hiss, it leaped towards them, claws outstretched. Ah! Both girls stumbled backwards into the road just as a car came zooming towards them. It screeched to a halt, and the driver gave a long, hard honk of the horn. Ah! Ivy and Maggie screamed even louder. Girls! Maggie's father hopped out of the car and rushed to them without closing the door behind him. What on earth is going on? He hugged them tightly as if they were both his daughters. They might well as be, considering how much of the time Ivy had spent at his house. Are you okay? You could have been seriously hurt. He brushed down their hair with his hands and kissed the tops of their head. Now, what has you both so spooked, huh? It's her, Dad, Maggie cried. It's the woman who lives next to... Nothing, Max. Ivy nudged Maggie a little more gently this time, but enough to get her to stop talking. Just a stupid game we were playing. We'll be more careful next time, promise. She smiled as sweetly as she could. Max eyed them both suspiciously before letting out a sigh of relief. All right, as long as you're sure. Maybe play inside for the rest of the evening. It'll look like there's a storm brewing. They looked up at the sky as the thunder began to rumble overhead. Only Ivy and Maggie noticed that the smoke clouds had a purple hue. That is the end of chapter 3. I don't know about you guys, but there is some strange things that I see happening in their little village. I don't know, do we think it's the witch? Is it a witch at all? This woman they call Amy? Will any of the grown-ups believe them? You'll have to come back tomorrow and we'll read chapter 4. Bye-bye now, sweetest of dreams.